Man, I tell you what. So, it is true that my wife fought a panther, but it is also true that I helped. You guys want to hear something real funny about vultures that I learned? Well, I don't know if she modified and said she killed it, but that she defeated it. And that word can mean different things in different contexts, don't you think? Now, check this out. There's another crazy story that I want to tell y'all about, or continue to tell y'all about, and it's about these fine people right here, Jim and Elizabeth, or as we call her, there, you is paying attention. I saw 2 ears on the side of your head, and I said, they must be for listening, and it turns out I was right. Now, Betty was graduating this here Red Brick College, Whitcliffe Bible College, where she was learning how to take languages and turn them into other languages so that people that didn't know the first language could learn the second language and learn the thing that the first language was trying to teach them about the last language. Make sense? Okay, good. Now, she was really good at this, so much so that everybody in her class said, man, oh man, God gave this woman a super special ability to do this here thing. And I think so too. Now, Jim was also at college. He had 1 year left at Wheaton Bible College. And he and Jim had still agreed that even though they wasn't going to get married quite yet, which is sad, they was going to continue to write letters back and forth to one another. And Jim had heard that right there in that tiny bitty country in South America, a country called Ecuador, that there was a really big need for people to come in and tell these Indians about Jesus. And so Jim said, I think that's something that maybe God is calling me to do. But now let me ask you this question. If you was a missionary and you was all by your lonesome out here in this place called Ecuador, would you want to do that by yourself? Or would you want to grab some of your buddies around and say, hey, come on, let's go? Yeah, of course you would want some buddies. And guess what? Jim was just like you. He said, man, I sure want to do what God's asking me to do. And I also want some of my friends who also love Jesus to do the same thing. Well, turns out he convinced his friend, Mr. Pete Fleming, and Mr. Ed McCulley to be missionaries with him. And so that's what they did. Jim began writing letters to a man named Dr. Tidmarsh. Now, Dr. Tidmarsh needed people to come to his missionary post in Ecuador in a place called Shandia, Ecuador. Shandia, Ecuador. Can you say that with me? Shandia? Shandia. That's right. Now, that's going to be super important later on. So, use those double ears that God gave you for listening, and we're going to remember that one. Now, Jim began praying and asking God if this was the place of all the places in the world that God wanted Jim to go be a missionary. And after meeting a man that had worked with the Quechua Indians in Ecuador, Jim decided that this is, in fact, where God wanted him to be. Now, at the same time, Jim also learned about these people. These people are Indians called the Auca Indians. Now, the Auca Indians were a savage tribe, and the Auca Indians did not like very much anybody coming around their tribe and trying to talk with them, definitely not coming around trying to set up camp on their land. So much so they didn't like it that everybody else who had tried to do it, these Indians had killed them. Now, Jim heard about these Indians, and what do you think he thought in his head? He said, man, these Indians are sinners, just like I'm a sinner, just like you're a sinner. And just because these Indians kill everybody that try to come to their land, they need Jesus just like I need Jesus. And so he started praying and asking God to please allow him some way to reach the Auca Indians so that he could tell them about Jesus. Now, Jim wrote a letter to Betty and told Betty all about what he thought God was telling him to do to that he would become a missionary in Shandia, Ecuador. And wouldn't you know it, Betty also had decided to become a missionary in Ecuador as well. Except instead of in Shandia, she was going to become a missionary to the people of the Colorado Indians in Ecuador. They both continue to love each other, as they do, and think that it would be best to remain unmarried and undistracted. Before you knew it, Jim, Betty, Ed, and his wife, and Pete were all headed for Ecuador. But first, they stopped in a place called Quito to begin learning Spanish. And here's a picture of the place that they went first. However, Betty would also need to start learning the language of the Colorado Indians. And Jim, Ed, and Pete would need to start learning the language of the Quechua Indians. Now, I don't know about you, but learning a different language like Spanish, like hola and burrito and enchilada, that would be difficult enough for me. But could you imagine learning that language and another language at the same time? Yeah, that's a super difficult task. But these fine people, because they love Jesus, they had set their minds to it, and they were going to do it. So, Betty got on a truck and traveled her way all the way to her mission post by truck. And eventually, the truck could not go any further. Not because it was broken, but because it looked like this. You can't get a truck through that, so they had to haul off that truck and continue walking through the jungle. Now, what do you think is in that jungle that might be dangerous? Snakes? Yeah? Jaguars? Yeah, well, jaguars ain't so dangerous to me. What else? Lots of things, right? These jungles are dangerous. And guess what else? Do you think a jungle is nice and cool and relaxing like? No, I tell you what, it is not. It's hotter than a cow on a Saturday afternoon without lemonade, I'll tell you what. The jungle was hot and wet. And there were all types of animals and reptiles that Betty had never seen before in her entire life. Also, they didn't have In-N-Out. So what was they going to eat without In-N-Out? Well, I'll tell you one thing they was going to eat, duck. Now, we know Jim's pretty good at killing duck, isn't he? Ooh, man, that poor lady. I felt so bad when I heard that story about that poor lady's duck. Yeah. And also manic root. They would eat lots of things from the land. Because out here in the jungle, they didn't have grocery stores. They didn't have really big farms set up. So this was all part of what they were going to establish out there. Now, when Betty got to the camp, she set out to get to create a written language. Because the people of the Indians, they didn't have books like we have. They didn't even have an alphabet set up yet. So part of what Betty needed to do, before she could give them the Bible in their own language, these people needed to have a language. So Betty found someone, a Colorado Indian that looked kind of like this man, who also spoke Spanish. Now that was super important because Betty spoke Spanish, the Colorado man spoke Spanish, and he also spoke the language of the people. So Betty would sit in her hut for hours and hours and hours and talk to this man in Spanish and have him tell her words in their native language, and then they would write it down in a book and start to begin to create a language for the Indian people that would one day turn into the Bible in their own language. He was the perfect person. Betty would sit for hours, as I said. Now, one other thing that she did while she was there is to help the Indians with a lot of their medical things. Now, you can imagine if you're out there in the jungle getting bitten by snakes all the time or having babies without hospitals, then it might be real difficult for you to have medicine to keep track of all of your healthy things that you need. Well, Betty came out here and helped them do that as well. So when they would get snake bits, bang, Betty was there to help with the snake bites. Or if a woman was having a baby and she might die, Betty was there to help and make sure with her medicine that she wouldn't die. These are all things that we don't even think about over here. Now, meanwhile, while Betty's doing all that hard work, guess what Jim, Pete, and Ed were doing? They were on their way to Shandia, and their journey took a ride on a yellow plane flown by a man named Nate Saint. Can you see that? Nate Saint? Nate Saint. Now, Nate Saint was a crazy airplane pilot, I tell you what. The things that he could do with that airplane were so crazy. Everybody who knew Nate Saint knew that if there was one person that was going to get you down into a jungle, it was going to be Nate Saint. And sure he did. He would bring them together with Dr. Tidmarsh on Jim's first visit to the Quechua Indians. When the plane landed, they had arrived. Well, almost. Just like Betty, when that plane landed, where do you think they had to go? On a long hike through that dangerous and treacherous forest. For 3 hours, they had to hike through that forest, carrying all their supplies on their back into this camp. And when they arrived, Jim said it was one of the most beautiful places he had ever seen in his life. And he could not wait to write to Betty to tell her all about it. Now, there was also some interesting things here in this camp. They had coffee, which I'm mighty fond of. They had papaya and pineapple and avocado to eat. And they also ate chanta worms. You guys want to see what a chanta worm looks like? Okay, I want to know that based on how much you say ew, if you would eat this chanta worm if somebody handed it to you like that. Oh, now, if one chanta worm wasn't so bad, look what they did right here. You see that? That's not pasta, y'all. That's just a whole pile of chanta worms that they grill up and say, here you go. Now, guess what? Now, I'll tell you what, Jim, being the good, fine Christian man that he was, didn't want to insult any Indians. So he grabbed that chanta worm, took a look at that, and swallowed that thing whole. Now, wasn't that mighty kind of him? I'm sure the Indians maybe have been chuckling a little bit about that. Now, Jim and Pete also had lots of tasks to do here because this camp was just kind of a small camp right now, but it was getting bigger and it was growing. And the doctor who brought Jim in there needed some big, strong men who maybe had been practicing wrestling. Jim's starting to pay off. He's got these big, strong bodies, and they were building another building and repairing all the other ones that were already there. And so Dr. Tidmarsh had asked Jim to please take over for him when it was his time to leave. While Jim was hard at work, Betty was also working hard to find a replacement. Because I'll tell you what, something terrible happened to that Colorado man. The one that was helping Betty translate all that, he was murdered. Someone had killed him while he was helping Betty. And so that was such a valuable part of what she was doing there that she needed to find a replacement. And after months of hard work, however, Betty received a super important letter. Now, who do you think that important letter was from? That's right. Now, she opened up that letter. Ooh, me. It's from my Twitter-pated boyfriend, Jim. And she was so excited to see that from Jim. And guess what it said? It said, meet me in Quito. Now, what could possibly be happening in Quito between Betty and Jim that he wanted so important for her to be there? Well, a few days later, Jim came and met Betty and said that he wanted to marry her. Now, I think Jim finally understood, I don't quite much like being all by my lonesome down in here in Shandia. And I got this real pretty girl over there serving with the Colorado Indians that I would really like to be down here with. But we can't do that unless we get married. So that's what he did. So they decided that they would get married because Betty said yes. Isn't that nice of her? They said yes. And they had to finish up the Colorado Indians' work first. So Betty and Jim went their separate ways so that Betty could finish up the work that she was doing, because you can't leave a thing half done. And then they would meet back together in Quito when they could get married. Now, Betty had worked so hard, and she found a replacement for her to take all of that information she had in the suitcase, and she would take it over. But you want to know something terrible happened to that suitcase? When it was being transported by Betty's new replacement, it was stolen off the back of that truck. Can you imagine all of that time and days and weeks and months spent with that Colorado man trying to translate all that stuff just to have somebody steal it from you? Now, that was hard for Betty to understand because God had placed her here. But she trusted God, that God was faithful and that God's will would be done even if things were real hard. And if one tragedy wasn't enough while Betty was dealing with her issues, Jim was trying to get ready for a wedding. And he had some of his own troubles. Because when he got back to his camp and they were done finishing all the work that they were doing, guess what started coming out of the sky? Rain. And do you think just a little itty bitty rain came out? I tell you what, no. It was a lot of bit of rain. Over and over and over. And it came and came and came. And before you knew it, all of that earth that was right next to their camp was just washing away, washing away, and washing away. And what my pappy used to say, when a water rise, a man be wise. And get! And that's what they did. They tried gathering everything they could. They got all the books that they could. They tried to grab all the supplies. But that rain was just coming too fast and too hard. And that river was pulling too much dirt away. And they couldn't get it. Unfortunately, just like Betty, they lost everything in that camp. But what were they going to do? Well, even though that's terrible things was happening, they went back, and guess what happened? They got hitched. The two of them finally got married. Ain't that the prettiest specialist thing you ever did hear? Yes, it did. But even though they were super excited to finally be married, now what are they going to do? What are they going to do? There's no place for them in Shandia. There's no place for them in the Colorado Indians. And so there's much more of this story. And I'll tell you what, my sweet wife is already going to be pretty upset that she didn't get to tell the love story, because we all know she loves a good love story, don't she? Yeah, she does. But so I'm going to save the rest of this for you all tomorrow.